Today we're going to be discussing the ethics of Immanuel Kant. So here you see my own little bookshelf of books on Kant. Kant is one of the most important philosophers ever to have lived. He's right up there with Plato, Aristotle, Descartes. He is perhaps the person who really defines modern philosophy. We're going to be looking at a number of aspects of his thought. Richard Rorty has said that Kant is really the person who turned philosophy into a profession. Before that, most philosophers actually did something else for a living. Leibniz, who was the teacher of Kant, was somebody who was a diplomat by trade. He wrote philosophy on the side. Descartes was a private tutor. John Locke was a medical doctor. David Hume was a historian, and so on. Spinoza was an eyeglass maker. So most philosophers throughout that modern period anyway were not really professionals. They did something else for a living and wrote philosophy on the side. But Kant was a professional professor of philosophy. And Rorty said, basically he turned it into a profession because his thought was so complicated that after Kant you had to be a professional to understand what was going on. So Kant is difficult. I don't know if you found the reading difficult. It is harder in the original German. I once did a sort of reading test to determine grade levels of various philosophers. Plato writes at about 10th grade level. Aristotle, 11th grade level. Kant, 17 and a half, okay? He's sort of like halfway through graduate school level. And that's in the English translations. The original German is way worse. Some native German speakers actually read Kant in English because the translators break up the sentences and make it easier to follow. So anyway, we're going to be looking at Kant's ethics today. And in particular, the role he assigns reason in ethics. David Hume has the view that ethics is really not about reason, it's about something else. It's ultimately founded on feeling. Kant is exactly the opposite of that. No, it's not feeling, it is reason. And his reasons for that actually closely relate to Hume. Anyway, we're going to look at two questions in Kant. I think it's helpful to see what's going on by distinguishing these questions. They're important from any philosophical point of view, but in Kant I think they become especially important. There is a question of how we tell right from wrong. And let's call that a practical test. I'm looking for something that I can have as a practical guide to what to do and what not to do. What's right, what's wrong. And then there's a more theoretical question we can ask. What makes right actions right? What makes wrong actions wrong? If something is a bad trait of character, what makes it a bad trait of character? And that's a different sort of question. Think about a scientific analogy. Suppose we're trying to distinguish acids from bases, for example. Well, there's a practical question of how we tell acids from bases, in practical terms, what we can use as a test. And then there's a theoretical question of what makes something an acid, what makes something a base. So think about the difference between those. As a practical matter, how do you tell whether something is an acid or a base? Okay. Yeah, you test for pH, and so you can do that in a variety of ways, using phenolphthalein or litmus paper or the kinds of pool chemical test things they give you when you have a swimming pool. There are a variety of chemical tests for this, but you determine the pH level, and that has something to do with this. So you might say, the litmus paper turned blue, and that tells you something. Or I put in this chemical, and it turned red, and that tells you something. But now, what about theoretically? What is it that makes an acid an acid? Come on, this is high school chemistry, folks. This isn't my card. What is it that makes a base a base?
It's concentration of hydrogen ions.
Yeah, good. Hydrogen ions in the case of an acid, right? It's the H pluses floating around that make it an acid, and it's the OH minuses floating around that make it a base. Okay, so it's either the positive hydrogen ions or the hydroxide ions that are negative that is going to determine this. So the theoretical question is different. And in fact, it's not much practical help, right? In this case, if I said, just go and find out if there are H pluses in the swimming pool, you don't know how to do that, right? That's not a very practical test. On the other hand, saying, drop in a bit of litmus paper is not a very theoretical answer to what makes an acid an acid. So there really is a difference, and we can ask both sorts of questions in ethical theory. Kant gives us a kind of answer. We will see that in a sense for him, right acts are rational acts. That's at least how we're going to think of it from a theoretical point of view. Practically, it's more helpful to think of this in a somewhat different way. Right acts, as a practical test, are respectful. And wrong acts are disrespectful, but in the more theoretical sense, a wrong act is, in some deep sense, irrational. So, there's going to be an answer to the question, why be moral here? In the end, it is the rational thing to do. By the way, there I have a little map that shows you where Kant lived. He never traveled more than 10 miles from the place of his birth, which was Kaliningrad, or in the old name that it had when he lived there, Königsberg. It was part of Prussia. Today, it's actually a part of Russia that is separated from the rest of Russia, separated from it by Belarus, Poland, the Baltic states. And so you can see where it is right there. Actually, there was recently a big issue. It was in the news because of missiles being placed there by Russia. If you're a math person, it's in the news because of the famous 7 bridges of Königsberg problem. So anyway, that's how I knew about it. Okay, so let me remind you of something from Aristotle. We distinguish intrinsic goods, things that are good for their own sake, things that are good in themselves, from instrumental goods, things that are good for the sake of something else. And indeed, we ask this question, what is good for its own sake? Well, the ultimate answer is happiness. Happiness is always good for its own sake and never for the sake of something else. There are lots of things that are good for their own sake and for the sake of something else, including virtues, moral virtues, intellectual virtues. Okay, it's good to be smart for a variety of reasons. It's good to have knowledge. It's good to be courageous. It's good to be generous. It's good to be kind, and so on. And all of those things are good for something else, namely living a good life and living well, you might say, but also they're good for various particular things. Kant begins by asking a similar question, but it's slightly different. He asks, what is a good without qualification? And what makes it different from a qualified good? So the distinction here is not really intrinsic good versus instrumental good. It's instead a good without qualification, as opposed to a qualified good. So an unqualified good is one that would be good no matter what, good under any circumstances, good under any conditions for anyone. A qualified good is good for something. It's good for someone. It's good under certain conditions. Good if certain conditions are fulfilled. Now the question he asks is, well, what is good without qualification? Are there things that are good without qualification? It's easy to think of qualified goods, right? Things that are good for certain purposes, instrumentally, or things that are good for something, good under certain conditions, good if various things happen. But is there anything, he asks, that is good without qualification? And here is his answer. A good will, he says, is not only good without qualification, but the only thing that's good without qualification. So let's take a look at how he says this and why. Here is how the whole work begins. Nothing can possibly be conceived in the world, or even out of it, which can be called good without qualification, except a good will. Now, right away, we see that Kant is after something big. Nothing can be conceived in the world or even out of it. What does that tell us about what he's looking for? What does he have in mind, even out of it? Yeah?
He's not looking for, he's looking for, concepts in the mind that
Good. He's looking for concepts in the mind that will tell you what is good no matter what, good under any possible circumstances. Not just what is good typically or what is good for mankind. It's very different from Aristotle's goal. Aristotle says right at the beginning, look, I'm talking about what is good for human beings, what it is for a human being to live a good life. And he says, I'm going to be able to tell you the answer only generally, for the most part. Okay? I'll be able to give those kinds of rules, but I won't be able to say anything with any kind of necessity. I'm talking about what is generally good for human beings in most circumstances. Kant is saying, I'm interested in something that is really going to be good no matter what, even outside this world. Now, what could be viewed as outside this world? What is he thinking about? Yeah. We might be looking for moral principles that can be applied to God, moral concepts that can be applied to God, or to angels, right? Or to aliens, okay? Aristotle asks, what is the good for mankind? But what if you want to ask, what is good for any kind of being at all? What is good for, in particular, Kant will say, rational beings? Whether they are human beings, or maybe animals, or, I don't know, Ferengi, Klingons. There could be all sorts of alien beings, right? And suppose an alien being viciously attacks another alien planet, destroys it, enslaves its people. Can we make any moral judgment? On Aristotelian grounds, you might say, well, I know what's good for humanity. I don't know what's good for Klingon or whatever these alien species are, so I can't say anything about that. But Kant would say that's ridiculous. Insofar as I know that these alien beings are rational beings, of course I can come to moral conclusions about that. If I encounter aliens on some world, as in Star Trek, then, gosh, I know what moral principles are involved in interacting with them. It's not as if I have to suddenly start over and say, throw ethics out the window. I don't know what's going to be good for these beings. I can talk about something that is good without qualification under any circumstance. Yeah?
So would Kant argue that those beings that we would say are able to access rationality can also access morality?
Well, it's important that those are rational beings. Yeah, they have to be able to access rationality. If they're really not rational beings, then nothing he'll say is really going to apply to them. And so, yeah, well, let's see. I can't... Are there examples in science fiction of encounters with beings that are alien life forms that are just not rational? That don't make decisions? That... What would that be like? Maybe microbes or something like that? I mean, they're not really rational beings. Yeah.
There's a 2001 monolith that doesn't really decide anything, it just influences.
Oh yeah, the monolith in 2001 might be like this, right? Is it a rational being? Well, not really. It's not really a conscious being at all, as far as we can tell, but it seems to exert this influence. And so yeah, in a case like that, we'd say, well, there we do hit a limit. But on the other hand, are these moral beings that we don't have to suppose that? Do they have a conception of the good life? What would it be to live well for them? We don't have to ask those questions to answer Kant's question, he thinks. And here's a way of seeing it graphically. You might ask about the things that are good for something in some context. And, lots of conditions are good for something, somehow, somewhere. Petri dishes are good for the growth of bacteria and fungi and so forth, but they're not really good for us. Then we can talk about what's good for mankind in general. We can talk about what's good for any rational agent. And that's a smaller set of things. Kant is looking for principles. Keep in mind here, he's a rationalist. And he is looking for principles that are going to be true necessarily and universally. So he thinks it is possible for us to have synthetic a priori knowledge in ethics of what is universally true, what is necessarily true. And that's already coming out in the first sentence. He's interested in things that are going to apply necessarily, be good no matter what, in this world or even in other possible worlds, even on other planets, even for the angels, even perhaps for God. So, he starts by looking at Aristotle's proposals for this. He says intelligence, wit, judgment, the other talents of the mind, however they may be named. Now what is he talking about here? Intelligence, wit, judgment. What are they in Aristotle's terms? Oh, Aristotle was an empiricist. We have to pull our minds all the way back to September. I know, that's difficult. 2 months ago. 2 months worth of philosophy, not to mention, 2,000 years of philosophy gone by, but yeah, they're intellectual virtues, right? They're virtues and specifically intellectual virtues. And then he turns, courage, resolution, perseverance as qualities of temperament. What are those? Moral virtues, right? They are undoubtedly good and desirable in many respects, but these gifts of nature may also become extremely bad, he says, and mischievous if the will which is to make use of them and which therefore constitutes what is called character is not good. So he's saying, look, intellectual virtues, moral virtues, yes, they're good things. They're good in themselves. Aristotle's right about that. But are they good without qualification? Are they good necessarily, no matter what? Answer is no. Now, why not? Why would intelligence sometimes be bad? Yeah.
If someone who is evil, who's using intelligence for
Someone who's, yeah, good. Someone who's using intelligence for evil. Suppose somebody does not have a good will. Suppose you've got an evil character. Okay, think of your favorite movie villain. It makes them worse that they're smart, right? It makes them worse if they're perseverant. One way to think about this is to think about your nemesis. Imagine that you've got an enemy. Somebody who hates you. Somebody who wants to destroy your life. All they do is plot day to day how to make you miserable. Okay? Now, there have been times at least where I thought I had such a person. But let's say this is just imaginary for you. You're just thinking, okay, what would it be like? Now, I'm imagining that arch villain out to get me. Is it better if that person is intelligent? If they're witty? Tell fun jokes as they get me? Is it better for me if they have good judgment? Is it better if they're courageous, if they're resolute, persevering, constantly trying to get me? Or would I prefer it that they're kind of stupid, dull, have bad judgment, are cowardly, right? Give up easily. What would you rather have as an enemy? The intelligent, brave, resolute person, or the stupid, cowardly person? Now, Kant gives a sort of different argument when he gets to the goods of fortune. Because there he says, look, what about things like power, riches, honor, health? Those are things also that we would have put in that intersection between the circles of instrumental goods and intrinsic goods. Are those sorts of things going to be always good, good without qualification? Is it always better, for example, to have power? Are there times when it would be bad to be powerful? Yeah. Okay, good. You might be the one who is in control, and everybody looks to you for the solution of some terrible problem, and you got nothing. Okay, then it might be a bad thing to be powerful, because in fact you're facing a problem you can't solve, and everybody expects you to solve it. Or are there occasions where riches would not be a good thing? Yeah.
Say, for instance, follow a lifestyle, some rich people live to that economics, which have riches, but you have all of this.
Okay, good. Maybe you want to follow the lifestyle of a Tibetan monk, and actually all these riches then are a problem for you. Makes it very hard, right? As in the biblical story of the rich young man who's not willing to give up that lifestyle, and so that could be a problem. It could be that riches are a problem for another reason. Maybe you're rich at the eve of the French Revolution, and it turns out that's a very bad thing to be, off with your head. Or you could think about Cambodia, where once Pol Pot came in charge, anyone who had any degree of education or any affluence was killed. So one test was, do you have eyeglasses? That tells you, that indicates you could read, that indicates some level of education and affluence, so you were executed if you had eyeglasses. Or here's how they used to tell what to do with children. They would give a child a hot bowl of rice. And the poor children, who weren't used to eating with spoons, would know to blow on the rice to cool it down before they touched it. But the children who had been rich enough to have a spoon to eat with were used to actually diving into the rice and then maybe blowing on the spoon. And so if the child reached in and burned his or her fingers by touching the hot rice, he or she would be beaten to death with a shovel. In those occasions, it wasn't just riches. I mean, it was even kind of a minimal prosperity. Did you have a spoon to eat with? That turned out to be something that gave you the death penalty. So these are circumstances where you say, yeah, it's not always good to be richer. Sometimes it's a terrible thing. What about health? Is it always a good thing to be healthy? I mean, it's pretty much always, but can you think of a case where it's actually a bad thing to be healthy? Yeah.
Maybe at the slave auctions, more goods or
Ooh, okay, you're being sold at a slave auction. Maybe then to be healthy is actually to your disadvantage. Because then you're going to get a higher price, but they're going to expect more out of you, and so maybe that's an occasion where you'd really rather be passed over and rejected than actually be highly sought after. What about another condition? Let's say, now here's the really big one. Aristotle says the final good is happiness, right? That's the thing that we're all really ultimately seeking. Eudaimonia, living well. Surely that is something that's good without qualification. Kant says, well, wait a minute, not so fast. Even happiness inspires pride and often presumption if there isn't a good will to correct its influence. So, are there occasions where happiness is actually bad for a person? Yeah. Ooh, okay, so, you might have several reasons why in a situation where, let's say, there's some sort of disaster that strikes, happiness is a bad thing. For one thing, if you're actually happy under such circumstances, you might think there's something morally wrong with you. But putting that aside, it may be that you're sitting there contented when you really ought to be working very hard to develop the skills you need to survive. And maybe prior happiness led you into a sense of complacency where you didn't develop skills you now need. Yeah?
maybe happiness out of ignorance. You don't know something bad happened, but you're happy nonetheless.
Good, happy because you just don't know what's going on. all sorts of disasters are occurring around you, and you're just completely unaware of it. You're oblivious. You're just walking around doing your own thing, and the world is falling apart, and you're just sitting there reading Pascal. Well, it might be that's a kind of occasion where your happiness is not really a good thing. You ought to be aware of what's going on around you. Yeah. Ooh, good. Yes. What about the murderer, the serial killer, who is happy when he gets a victim? Okay, that's a case where we look at the happiness and think that happiness isn't a good thing. Here's the guy sitting there thinking, very happy. Why? Because I lured another person to his death last night. You think that? No, look, that's not good. And notice what Kant says. Actually, he's about to say something highly relevant to this. He says, the sight of a being who isn't adorned with a single feature of a pure and good will, enjoying unbroken prosperity, can never give pleasure to an impartial, rational spectator. This becomes a key test. Could somebody who is not involved, but who is rational, approve of this? Well, would they always approve of somebody being happy? The answer is no. Suppose I do make a movie about a serial killer, and the person is very happy when they get away with these crimes, and at the end they never get caught. And so they live a life of happiness, continuing to murder people. That would be a crummy movie, wouldn't it? I mean, at the end, the guy lives happily ever after, but keeps killing all these victims. And you think, man, I don't want to watch a movie like that. Right? I'm an impartial, rational spectator when I go to the movies, and I don't want to see the bad guy getting away with it. I want to see the bad guy in the end suffer. And so the impartial, rational spectator doesn't really approve of the happiness, the continued happiness of somebody without even a vestige of a goodwill. Now, if the person has some element of it, maybe you say, there's something that makes that character redeemable. But suppose there isn't. Suppose there's nothing good about this character at all. Then, in fact, their unbroken prosperity seems to us disturbing, not something to be approved of. Actually, there are movies that are sort of like this. Goodfellas is my favorite candidate for a movie where the heroes, if I can call them that, are pretty disgusting, terrible people. And where it seems just awful to think of them being happy. To take the scene where the guy delivers the pizza too slowly, and so he just shoots him in the foot. And later they murder the guy, just because he brought the pizza too slowly. I mean, those are bad people, and I don't want them to get away with it in the end. I want them to suffer. Well, anyway, that's just me. Maybe you feel differently. Maybe you think, no, I'd like to be able to shoot pizza guys too. But that's bad, okay? That's something that shouldn't make you happy, and if it does, that's something a rational, impartial spectator would disapprove of. Now notice there's another element of what he mentioned a moment ago, that happiness can inspire pride and presumption if there isn't goodwill to go along with it. Think of people who enjoy success very young, okay? Can you think of people who are ruined by that? They do enjoy great prosperity, great honor, great success, great esteem at a very early age, but they're too immature to handle that, and it ends up ruining their life. Lindsay Lohan, yeah. Take almost any Disney Channel star, right? 5 years later, and they're good examples of this sort of thing, where happiness not under the right conditions ends up inspiring pride and presumption and really sets somebody up for a fall. So it is very easy to find cases in popular culture of people who have suffered in exactly the way Kant envisions here. Now, what he's saying really is, look, there is one thing underlying all of this. If all those are bad candidates, what's the good candidate for something that is good without qualification? It's a goodwill. But that just raises the question, well, what's that? He says a goodwill is something that would act on the basis of universal considerations. Okay, would not be influenced by subjective, particular determinations. And I think the easiest way to imagine this is to imagine that I'm assigning your grades at the end. And what do you want me to be influenced by? What should I not be influenced by? So here's the point, really. The proper and inestimable worth of an absolutely good will, he says, consists just in this, that the principle of action is free from all influences of contingent grounds. So, imagine that I am actually doing this assignment of grades. And my question is, what are some things that I should be taking into account? What are some things I shouldn't? First proposal of things I shouldn't take into account is, let's say, who you're voting for tomorrow. I shouldn't be thinking about that, right? I should not be, at the end, be thinking, this, for one thing, I wouldn't know. But suppose I did know, I shouldn't be evaluating anything like that. That shouldn't be making any difference. What are some other things that shouldn't be making any difference to my assignment of your grade? Yeah. I'll say it again. Good, the color of your shirts. Okay, I sit there and I think, yeah, gee, I like yellow. Who has yellow shirts on? Oh man, like nobody. That guy has one, but he's not wearing it. So, all right, you all lose, no A's, no yellow shirts. Right, that would be ridiculous. I shouldn't be doing that. What are some other things? Yeah.
Your personal opinion about the subject matter.
Good,
Not the other person writes about that matter.
Yeah, exactly. My own personal opinion about it. So there are some philosophical issues here that I do have personal opinions on. Should I evaluate your paper on whether I agree with your criticism of Kant or Aristotle or Descartes or whoever it is? No, of course not. I should be evaluating on the basis of how well you're philosophizing, not on the basis of whether I, in the end, agree with your position or not. So that's something that would be a subjective, particular determination, my own preference, the answer I would give to that. That's not something I should be using in evaluating what you're doing. Are there other things that it would be clearly wrong for me to consider? Yeah.
Whether or not I'm good in like French class or not.
Okay, good. Good or bad in some irrelevant respect. Is he good in French? Well, who cares, right? That has no bearing on his philosophy grade. And so this is something that I should not be taking into account. I shouldn't sort of say, whoa, I happen to know that guy's a great bass player. And so, A, right? That's irrelevant to how you are in philosophy. Are there other things like that? Yeah. Okay, good. My mood shouldn't matter, right? It's like, oh man, woke up with a headache this morning, I'm in a bad mood. They all fail. I shouldn't be doing that. My own particular feeling at the time shouldn't really be relevant to the grade that you deserve. So what are some things that I should be paying attention to? Yeah? Your performance, exactly. Your performance on things that are relevant to the course. And so I should be paying attention to how clearly you express yourself, how well you back up what you say with arguments, how well you understand the philosophical issues, how well you can present an argument of your own, and so forth. But I shouldn't be paying attention to all these other contingent things. Now that is in general, you might say, what I should be doing. I should be acting from duty, out of respect for the moral law. I have a certain duty here to evaluate you on the basis of your philosophical ability and performance, and that's what I ought to be doing, not any of these other things. And so the fact that I happen to like you personally, or that I happen to disagree with the conclusion you come to with respect to John Locke's philosophy or whatever, none of that should matter. I should be acting from duty. Now, there are two kinds of moral theory, and Kant is very clearly giving us not only an example of one of these two kinds, but an extreme example. A consequentialist says that the value of an action depends entirely on its consequences. And so we've looked at examples of consequentialists like Bentham and Mill, who in the end say, look, it's the consequences of actions that determine the moral value of those actions, determine whether they're good or bad, right or wrong, etc. Deontologism is the view that it depends on more than just consequences. And so, are consequences everything? Well, if you answer yes, you're a consequentialist. If you answer no, you're a deontologist. But now, you might say, well, I suppose the answer is no. How much do they matter? The answer could be anything from, well, a lot, but not everything, to not at all. And Kant has the extreme view that they matter not at all. So he says, here's how we go about evaluating actions. Think about it this way. A person with a certain character acts on the basis of certain motives, forms an intention, performs the action, that action has certain consequences. Where do we start in thinking about whether the action is right or wrong? Well, a virtue theorist says start with character. A consequentialist says start with consequences. Look at what comes after the action and then work backwards here. A deontologist is going to typically decide either on the basis of the character of the action itself, like does it violate one of these rules, or is going to say it's a question of what comes before the act, comes up to that point. At least in part. It might also depend in part on the consequences. But it depends at least partly on something before the consequences. Well, Kant, as I mentioned a moment ago, is an extreme deontologist. That is to say, he thinks that the moral quality of the action does not depend at all on the consequences. We judge entirely by the agent's intentions, by what he calls the Maxim, which he defines as the subjective principle of volition. Why you're doing this thing. We could say maybe the reason for your action, with only a slight bit of, I think, distortion of his meaning. It is something like a rule that reflects the agent's intention. There's another bit of terminology we need to understand Kant. An imperative is something that is a command. It expresses a command, either in the form do or do not, or with an ought or should, like you ought to do this or you should not do that. These can be hypothetical or they can be categorical. A hypothetical imperative has an if in it. So it says you ought to do this if blah, blah, blah. Or it gives a command, says don't do that if you don't want blah, blah, blah. And so there's an if clause in a hypothetical imperative, but a categorical imperative doesn't have it. It's simply do or do not. Do this, don't do that. There are no qualifications on when you're supposed to be doing this, under what conditions. It's something you could say no matter what. So now we have a tool, and it should remind you of something, right? And a hypothetical imperative tells you what you ought to be doing under certain conditions. A categorical imperative tells you what you ought to be doing no matter what. Well, that tells us something really, really important. A hypothetical imperative is something that depends on your circumstances, your goals, your desires. And so it's ideally suited for expressing the connection between means and ends. It's a perfect way to talk about what we think in connection with qualified goods. If something is a qualified good, a good under certain conditions, we can say, great, you want to pursue that good under those conditions. If you're in one of those conditions, then you ought to pursue those goods. So, a qualified good and a hypothetical imperative go hand in hand. But now it's just the opposite for categorical imperatives. Those just say do or do not. Thou shalt not. They're independent of goals, of desires, of circumstances, of anything in particular about you. They apply universally. And notice they apply to unqualified goods. An unqualified good is good no matter what. And so actually we can always give somebody the advice, pursue that unqualified good. So what does that tell us? It tells us something really, really important about the nature of categorical imperatives. There is one and only one unqualified good, according to Kant, namely having a good will. So there's really only one categorical imperative possible. And the most natural way to put it, really, in this language, is to say, you ought to have a good will. Now, he never expresses it in exactly that form. But I think that's the basic idea that ties all of his various formulations together. There is one thing that's always good no matter what, having a good will. So there's one thing I can advise you no matter what, have a good will. But now, what does that mean? Well, the first thing it means is this: a good will acts only on the basis of universal considerations. So, I'm in effect saying, always act on the basis of universal considerations. You ought to act, in other words, on the basis of principle. You shouldn't decide, oh, yeah, I like that, don't really like that, gee, I'm in a bad mood, blah, 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 blah. No, you should be deciding on the basis of general principles. In fact, universal principles, principles that really exclude all of those subjective particular determinations. And so here is his first formulation of the categorical imperative, the one principle that he gives us the entire foundation for morality. Act only on that maxim you can at the same time will to be universal law. Some translations have it slightly differently. Act only on the maxim that you can will to become a universal law. Another way to put this is act as if everybody were going to be acting on the basis of your maxim. To put it negatively, don't make an exception for yourself. So Kant at one point says, what is the basis, the true nature of immorality? Is it people acting according to the wrong rules? He says no. It's people acting according to the right rules, but making an exception for themselves. So think about a thief. A thief is somebody who is going to rob from other people. Does that thief himself think it's okay to rob him? Suppose you find out that somebody is, maybe one of your roommates is a thief, and he's been stashing the things he steals in the closet, and you steal it. What do you think the roommate's reaction to that is going to be? He's going to say, hey, I live by the rule. Take what you want. You took what you wanted. That's cool. Probably not, right? The thief is not going to want to be robbed. The murderer is not going to want to be murdered, right? I mean, think about Dexter. Dexter catches these people who've done terrible things and murders them. And then they say, when they get caught by Dexter, fair's fair. I live by the rule. Kill, man. You're doing it, so I'm totally cool with this. No, they don't react that way. And so Kant is saying these people are not people who really operate consistently under the rules steal, kill, and so on. They actually don't want to be stolen from. They don't want to be killed. Instead, what they do is make an exception for themselves. And he says that's the great temptation, to make an exception for yourself. And so the moral person doesn't do it. There is a moral test underlying all of this. Here's the first thing you do. Identify the maxim. So you basically say, why are you doing it? What is really going on in your mind? What is your reason? What is this subjective principle of action? And then we ask, could it be a universal law? Could everybody act on the basis of that? Sometimes, as we'll see, his answer is going to be no. And then we can ask, well, if they could I will it to be a universal law? So not just is it possible that everyone could act on the basis of this, but could I as a rational being will that happen? And if the answer is no at any point, then the action is impermissible. So let's take a simple case. Should I steal something that I want? What do I do? Well, I start by saying, what's my maxim? Maybe the maxim here, if it's a simple case, is just steal, take what you want. B, could that be a universal law? Could everyone go around stealing from everyone else? His answer is no. And it's sort of a clever argument. He says, here's why. In a world where everybody just stole from everybody else, there would be no such thing as property. So there'd be nothing you could steal. There would be no such thing as stealing because nobody would own anything. Because the rule would just be, take whatever you want. And so it would be impossible to have a world where everybody operated on the principle, steal what you want. Because such a world would not be one where anybody owned anything. So stealing would be impossible. So he concludes stealing is unjust. And there was a cute little graphic there of a kid stealing an apple, but it didn't come through. Sad, sad, sad. Okay, well, I'm going to just skip to his examples. His key examples are these: suicide, talents, promises, and then charity. So some of these are perfect obligations, one where there's another person who really has a right to your doing this, and others are not. Some of them involve the self, some involve other people. So I'm going to skip past that a little bit and just go straight to our first example. This is an example. Actually, the first example he discusses is suicide, but what he says about it is weird, so I'm going to postpone that and deal with the easy case. Promises. Suppose somebody is forced by necessity to borrow money. He knows he won't be able to repay it, but sees nothing will be lent to him unless he promises stoutly to repay it. So he desires to make the promise. But he has enough conscience to ask himself, well, is it unlawful and inconsistent with duty to get out of trouble in this way? Suppose he resolves to do so. Then the maxim of the action would be expressed in this way. When I think I'm in want of money, I'll borrow it and promise to repay it, though I know I can never do it. Now, this principle of self-love, he says, might be consistent with my whole future welfare. In other words, I might get away with it. But is it right? And he says, I put it as a universal law. How would it be if my maxim were a universal law? So my maxim is whenever I need money, I'll borrow it, promise to repay it, even though I'm falsely promising. Suppose everybody were to do that. Suppose that were to become a universal law. Could there be such a universal law? He says, no. I see at once it could never hold as a universal law of nature. It would contradict itself. Why? Well, suppose it were a universal law that everybody in difficulty made these false promises borrowing money. What would happen? He says the promise itself would become impossible. Why? Because nobody would consider that anything was promised to them, would ridicule all such statements as vain pretenses. So suppose everybody who needed money were to lie about paying it back. Who would loan anybody money? Right? Suppose there were such a world. Everybody lies about promise of paying back money. And I come to you and say, hey, listen, I'm really hungry and I don't have money for lunch. Can I borrow $5? I'll promise to give it back to you on Wednesday. Are you going to give me the $5? Because people are, you promise, right? Promises don't mean anything in such a world. And so it becomes impossible to actually commit, to actually promise, which makes promising impossible, which makes false promising impossible. So in the end, Kant says, look, here's the maxim. Make false promises. But if everybody did that, there would be no such thing as promising. So making false promises is unjust. It is wrong. We have a perfect obligation to keep our promises. Yeah.
I'm sort of confused about the last step here. Can you give an example where a will pass is universal, but you will attempt? That's the
Okay, yes. How about an example where you could do this, but nobody could will it? Let's look at the next example he gives about talents. Okay, you have an obligation, he says, to develop your talents. Now, suppose somebody finds in himself a talent with, that he could develop, make him useful in many respects, but he's comfortable, prefer to indulge in pleasure rather than take pains to improve his happy natural capacities. So he asks whether this maxim of neglecting his natural gifts also agrees with what's called duty. He sees a system of nature like this could subsist with such a universal law. In other words, think of this as a slacker imperative, right? A slacker maxim. Yeah, I'm just going to goof off. I'm just going to be a slacker. What if everybody did that? What if everyone were a slacker? And well, that could happen. He said it could be like the South Sea Islanders, which he imagines just, lying around on the beach enjoying themselves. Clearly never watched an episode of Survivor. But anyway, suppose we just did that. Said, hey, I'm just going to go lie on the beach, man. That's my life. And suppose everybody does that. We all just say, yeah, screw it. We're all going to just go and lie on the beach. Now, that could happen. But could a rational being will it? Now, what would happen if we all decided to do that? We all just gave up whatever we were doing, whatever we were working hard at, and said, forget it. I'm just going to go lie on the beach. Yeah. Life would sort of be purposeless, but also, that's actually really important. It would be purposeless. There are other practical problems. Like at first, you're just sitting there sipping a beer, but eventually you run out of beer. And where are all the people who would otherwise have brought you a beer? They're just lying on the beach, right? Hey, you're supposed to be brewing the beer. Oh, man. So anyway, there are difficulties like that, but the more fundamental difficulty is that as a rational being, I will that my faculties be developed. After all, they serve me. I am a being who is rational, and in part that means I choose means to attain my ends, and I value my ability to use means to attain my ends. Well, that's just what talents are. And so as a rational being, I necessarily value my own rationality, my own ability to actually attain my goals using those means. And so a rational being is somebody who necessarily values rationality. So slacking off is something that's going to actually contradict that, which means that a life of spring breaks would really not work out very well for me. It would not be a rational choice. Ignore that UT Longhorn flag in the right-hand corner. Or here's another image of such a life. Okay, in the end, it doesn't really work out to be satisfying to a rational being. So last time we were discussing the basic idea, the thought that there is one and only one thing that is good without qualification, namely goodwill, that a categorical imperative is one that would imply no matter what. It would apply no matter what. It would be something that holds in all circumstances for all people. And so it naturally goes along with the idea of an unqualified good. Well, since there's only one good without qualification, namely goodwill, there could really be only one categorical imperative, namely have a goodwill. And since having a goodwill, according to Kant, means first and foremost acting on the basis of universal considerations, that means the categorical imperative has the content that one should act on the basis of universal consideration. In other words, act only on that maxim. You can at the same time will to be universal law. And last time we saw a couple of examples of that. We discussed promising, for example, falsely promising. We also talked about stealing. He gives other examples. For example, charity. He contemplates somebody who is looking at somebody who thinks, hey, I've got it pretty good, I can help other people, should I? What concern is it of mine? Let everybody be as happy as heaven pleases, or be as he can make himself. I won't take anything from anybody, or envy that person, but neither do I wish to contribute to his welfare. And he goes on to say, well, if this were universal law, now remember the first part of the test, identify the maxim. So we've done that. I'm going to look out for myself. I'm going to leave other people to look out for themselves. I'm not really going to help them. Well, he says if that were a universal law, now here's the second part of our test. Is that something that could be followed universally, that everyone could follow? And his answer is yes. The human race might very well subsist, and doubtless even better than in a state in which everyone talks of sympathy and goodwill, or even takes care occasionally to put it into practice, but on the other side also cheats when he can, betrays the rights of men or otherwise violates them. So in short, he's saying, yeah, it could happen that everybody acts selfishly with a focus only on their own self-interest. In fact, such a world might be better than that kind of world, in fact, maybe better than our world. But nevertheless, he says a rational being couldn't will it. And that's the third part of the test. Could a rational being will such a world where everybody followed that? He says, well, no. It would be impossible to will that. Why? A will that resolved this would contradict itself, inasmuch as many cases might occur in which one would have need of the love and sympathy of others, and in which by such a law of nature sprung from his own will, he would deprive himself of all hope of the aid he desires. Some translations have it as this. He would often encounter situations where he needed the love and sympathy of others. And so his idea is that, hey, can I resolve consistently to just live for myself, not helping others? Well, no, because at certain times I'm going to need the help of others. So although there could be a world where everybody lives that way, there's no contradiction in that. Nevertheless, I as a rational being couldn't will it, he says. So let's take the case of the Good Samaritan who comes along and finds the person beaten on the side of the road. Should the Good Samaritan help? Might be tempted like others to pass by and do nothing. But he says, well, what if everybody did that? Could everybody act that way, purely selfishly, not helping somebody in need? Yes, they could. On the other hand, a rational being couldn't will it. And why? Because I could be that guy in the road. I might need the love and sympathy of others. I might need help. And so the argument here is related to the golden rule. And in general, this version of the categorical imperative could be seen as a variant of the golden rule. The golden rule says treat others as you would want to be treated. Kant doesn't like that formulation of it because it seems to make it subjective, as you would want to be treated, as if your subjective wants, desires, are the relevant thing. He says it's really not that. It's a question of could you as a rational being will to be treated that way? Moreover, because he's concerned about cases involving promising or borrowing and lending or other broad social practices, it's not just what if that person did it to me? Gosh, how much good does it do you to say to the loan officer, well, if I were in your shoes, I'd give me a loan, this type of thing. That's not really relevant. What matters is what happens if everybody does that. So you can see him as changing the golden rule here in two ways. One, getting rid of subjective desires and plugging in what a rational being could will. But secondly, saying, it's not just a matter of the tables being turned and me being treated that way specifically. It's a question of really everyone treating everyone that way. Certain things are going to emerge only if we think of it very broadly. Test. We've got here, I think, in Kant, an attempt to actually explain what it is that makes right actions right. They are ones that actually do act on the basis of principle, where the person has a maxim they can universally will as a law. However, that's a complicated thing, right? And the argument is somewhat tricky. You have to think, wait, what happens if everybody steals, for example? And in fact, nobody can steal because there's no such thing as property. That's a weird and tricky argument. And so that's really not great as a practical test, and in fact, Kant and a variety of Kantians disagree about what its implications are. He gives us another formulation, however, that is much easier to use and much easier to understand. And it's a sort of practical test based on that theoretical account. Here's the general idea. Someone with goodwill acts out of respect for the moral law. They act out of duty. So they do the right thing for the right reason, specifically that it is the right reason, and that it is the right thing to do. So they treat others as rational beings. And here's in a way the key premise. Rational beings essentially value their own rationality. Why? We've already seen that with respect to developing talents. The idea is really that I am, as a rational being, somebody who values my ability to use means to attain my goals. And that's what rationality is. It's that ability to use various means to attain my goals. Well, as a rational being, I value that, so I value my own rationality. So he says at one point, rational nature exists as an end in itself. I necessarily value my own rationality. But I can't do that just for myself. I have to apply that universally. So I have to respect rationality wherever it occurs. So we can get out of this, I ought to respect rational agents in general. I ought to respect moral agents. And so here's one way of putting this. His framing of the thing is the last thing I have on the slide. Treat people as ends, never as means. I should treat humanity always as an end in itself, never as a means only. But a nice way of putting this is just, well, you have to respect people. don't use people. And again, it's not just human beings, really, though he does use the term humanity here. It really is a question of respecting all rational beings. Respecting rationality in myself, but respecting rationality in anyone. Well, here's how he frames it more precisely. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. So I should never merely use myself or use another person for my own ends. I've got to treat everybody as an autonomous moral agent. I have to respect your right to make decisions and live your way. You have to respect my right to live my way. And so we might think of this in the following sort of way. If we apply it to these four cases he's talked about, let's look at the false promise case. It clearly uses someone. If I make a false promise to you in order to borrow some money that I know I can never repay, I'm using you to get that money, right? And there's an obvious sense in which I'm using you as a means to my own ends. Developing my talents, that's trickier because it involves the self. But the idea here is I'm using myself, my own life, my own rationality purely for enjoyment. I'm not giving myself full respect as a rational agent. I am not developing my own rationality, and so I'm not respecting my own rationality. And the same thing is true in cases of charity. If I don't help you when you're in need, then actually I'm not giving you full respect as a rational agent. Now, people have disputed whether that really makes sense. He does say here, after all, there's a different sort of thing going on. I'm obviously using you if I borrow money from you under false pretenses. Am I as obviously using you if I just pass you by on the side of the road after you've been beaten by the robbers, like as in the Good Samaritan case? And in that case, it's not so obvious that I'm using you by walking by, but I'm certainly not respecting your rational agency. After all, you're in a position that you were a victim, right? You were harmed by somebody else. Your rational agency would be one to restore your own ability to act, and so I have an obligation to help you do that. I'm really not respecting your rationality if I merely pass on by. I'm not doing anything to injure it. I'm not directly using you in a certain sense. And yet, from another point of view, neither am I showing you respect as a fellow human being or a fellow rational agent. So the practical test comes down to this, he says. I respect my own autonomy, and I have to respect your autonomy. What does autonomy come to? It's not just freedom. It's my ability to set rules for myself. So he says, at one point, in another formulation, imagine myself as a legislator in a kingdom of ends where we all treat one another with respect, where we all treat one another as ends in ourselves rather than as means. If I imagine myself setting rules for that, I'm included in that kingdom, and so I'm setting rules for myself. So in the end, he says, here's why morality has its particular power. It's not just that rules are being imposed on me from outside. I am setting rules for myself. I am saying these are rules that I can legislate, not only for myself, but for everyone who is part of this kingdom of ends, and you might say a kingdom of respect for other people's autonomy. Indeed, it's that gives me dignity. Why am I not merely a thing to be used? Why am I not something that has a price? No, I am something that has a dignity. And why? Because of that, because of my autonomy, my ability to establish my own rules for my life and live according to the rules I set for myself. Well, here's my little map for how all this goes. We've got the idea of the goodwill as fundamental. Then that leads us to the formula of universal law. You should act only on the maxim, you could will as a universal law. That leads us to the formula of the law of nature. Act only on a maxim, you could will as a law of nature. In other words, really not just that people choose to follow, but that they have to follow. That leads us to this formula of humanity. You should treat humanity as always as an end in itself, never as a means only. That leads us to the idea of autonomy. That leads us to this idea of the kingdom of ends. And ultimately, that brings us back to the formula of universal law, because I realize if I'm legislating for the kingdom of ends, I'm really establishing universal laws that apply to everyone, including me. And so all of these turn out to be equivalent ways of putting the same insight, the same imperative, which, as I've expressed it, is essentially have a good will.